Oh my god. Man, virtual background sucks so much. What the
Startup review.
The virtual background sucks, I know, but I can't do anything about it because my place is a mess, just like my life. Okay, we will talk about the Human Things Genki ShadowCast. Human Things, you might have heard them or about them in the past from their past successful Kickstarters, such as the Genki Audio, which was the Bluetooth adapter for the Nintendo Switch. They would have been the first to market if they weren't beat to it by HomeSpot, was it? Or no, the other one. Ghoulie Kit, yeah, they would have been first if it wasn't for you meddling kids. And also the Genki Covert Dock, which is really cool product. I think I have it back there somewhere, which you can't see because it's being covered by the virtual background. Oh well. They recently launched a Kickstarter and well, not recently, a month ago, launched a Kickstarter for this ShadowCast, and it succeeded, and I got mine. If you're short on time, here's the gist of the raw data that I gathered from my testing. Boom, graphs. The baseline latency of my switch dock directly to my monitor averages to about 142.7 milliseconds. This is important to note because the following measurements all take this latency into account. This is the actual latency one would experience when sitting in front of the TV or monitor. There's a graph later on that shows the measured latencies minus this baseline in case you want to get an idea of how much delay there is without factoring in input latency. Now, plugging in the ShadowCast and PC between the dock and monitor using Genki's arcade app is 206.75 milliseconds on average. Take note of that because they advertised the app to be the faster way to use the Genki ShadowCast, but apparently it isn't, at least in my testing, because when I used the OBS instead, by adding the ShadowCast as a video capture device source, it added 183.85 milliseconds on average, which is like 20 milliseconds lower. And doing it as a window capture instead of a video capture device, it added about 285.95 milliseconds. I think that is where Genki was getting its measurements from because that's more in line with the expected use case. Although why anyone would use a window capture of the arcade app when they can already use OBS to directly capture the ShadowCast is beyond me. Maybe there's some, playing with scenes and stuff. There's some fringe use cases for streamers who really want to go extra with their sources and their scenes, but I wouldn't do it that way. There was a consistent delta of like 27 frames latency between the OBS and the arcade app. So looking at OBS and the Genki Arcade app side by side on your desktop, you probably wouldn't notice too much latency because at 60 FPS, this is like less than half a frame difference. Now, to compare with other capture cards, right now I only have my Elgato 4K 60 Pro because I sold my HD 60S. So using the 4K 60 Pro on Elgato's 4K capture utility, it's about 390.55 milliseconds latency on average, which is almost twice that of the ShadowCast. So that's good. The ShadowCast is twice as fast as using a 4K 60 Pro, but the 4K 60 Pro has a pass-through, an HDMI pass-through. And for some reason, when I use the HDMI pass-through on the 4K 60 Pro in 4K capture utility, the overall latency that was added to the whole experience was only 305.25. So I don't know why, but using the pass-through reduced the latency count, which is super weird. The pass-through feed itself had an average latency of 183 frames, again at 960 frames per second. In 60 frames per second, this is closer to 11 or 12 frames, which is 190.62 milliseconds. And just for kicks, I measured the latency of the Switch's built-in screen undocked, which resulted in an average latency of 168.2 milliseconds. This is interesting because it's higher than the docked result, which was 142.7 milliseconds. It's higher by 25.5 milliseconds, or 15 to 16 frames at 60 frames per second. Now, I'm 100% sure that this is dependent and highly dependent on your interconnects. So it depends on your TV or monitor that's connected to your switch dock. It depends on maybe the cables or the cable lengths. I don't know. Maybe that's not true. But there's a whole bunch of things that I can't test for because I only have my one rig. Here's what everything looks like when you add it to the average baseline latency, as well as what that means in frames when you consider 60 frames per second. Okay, there are some caveats that I should tell you before you go about in making your own conclusions based on this data. Number one, I don't have an HDMI splitter, which would be used to isolate video signal latency alone. The best I can do is to record footage of the screen, which is what I did. So I recorded footage of the screen using a 960 FPS camera, and then I manually counted the frames between pressing a button and a response showing up on the screen. So that means that all the measurements that I took inherently include the input controller latency, or rather the controller input latency, which I'm sure Genki, rather human things, did not factor in to any of their marketing things, because why would they? They have no control over that. They shouldn't be held accountable for controller input latency. Number two, the frame counting, as I said, is done manually, and unfortunately I am not yet an android, I'm not yet a robot, I'm only a human, and I make human mistakes. So I try my best to make sure that I'm picking the best start and end points where I should be counting the frames from, but some amount of subjectivity is to be expected. And number three, I backed the ShadowCast myself, and I ordered 3 units actually because I believe in the project. I trust that Human Things is a stand-up company based on their past projects and their past, their past successful Kickstarters, which I have backed all of them. I received everything, and they all work pretty good. So I didn't hope that ShadowCast would be latency free, because I do have experience with other capture cards like the Elgatos and the AverMedia. I forget which AverMedia I had, but it was one of them. I know that every capture card has some form of input latency. So, if the ShadowCast would be slightly faster than what I currently owned, I would have considered that a pleasant surprise rather than an expectation. So those are the caveats. If you want more details and more insights based on the other features of the Genki ShadowCast, stick around because I have a lot to say. Genki claims, based on their Kickstarter, that there's 0 to 0.02 seconds or 20 milliseconds of latency when using the ShadowCast with their Genki Arcade, which is, if that's true, awesome. But then again, they don't specify whether this measurement is of the total latency of the entire video chain, or if it's just the additional latency that you would get, or that you would add by plugging in the ShadowCast in between your dock and your monitor. Actually, you would even be adding a computer or a laptop in between that too, so that would add a little bit of latency. In my opinion, it's safe to assume that Genki, or rather Human Things, meant the latter, because the testing method that they showed in their Kickstarter video was that they got an HDMI splitter, and they fed the video signal to both the ShadowCast and a standalone TV simultaneously. So they showed the difference in latency by showing the difference in in-game timers in, I believe it was Hades and Super Smash Bros. On each screen at the same time. My testing differs in that I'm using a camera set to film at 960 frames per second, and then I'm counting the number of frames manually between the time that it takes to press the button, the trigger button, or not trigger, the shoulder button on my controller, and the time that it takes for a response to appear on the screen. And I am doing this because, honestly, I don't have an HDMI splitter. If I did have an HDMI splitter, I would prefer to, feed the video signal to 2 separate monitors, one with the ShadowCast and one without, so that I can see exactly how much latency just the ShadowCast adds to the total feed. But I still think that, yes, I think that my method is if not more accurate, then a more appreciated way of getting the numbers, for gamers and streamers who want to know what it will be like to actually use the thing. Because 0.02 milliseconds is great, but if you're not seeing that, then at least you should know what the real latency is. I didn't expect it to be like 0.02 milliseconds, because that's crazy, unless Genki was just talking about the actual video output latency and not anything else, like the latency between switch and dock and ShadowCast and ShadowCast and computer and monitor. I doubt that is what Genki was talking about. It did seem a little scummy to me at first when they said 0.02 ms for the latency. But then again, they never said where was the start of it and where was the end. So I guess they're in the clear. Yeah, so for me, I can still play-ish with that kind of latency of 20 to 21 frames. There was a little bit of getting used to with regards to the pixelation, the not pixelation, the compression of the video, because they have to, somehow fit all of that data, all of that video data into a USB 3.0 at 60 frames per second. So you're going to see artifacting and compression artifacts. That took a little bit of getting used to, more so than the frame rate for me. But, for a lot of people, as long as the frame rate is solid, they're good. They're good with what they buy. And for, what is it, $39 for the Kickstarter? I'm not sure how much the MSRP is. I'll put it on the screen somewhere. But for however much it costs, it's still cheaper than anything on Elgato's lineup. There are cheaper, China brand or no brand capture cards. And by the way, someone else on YouTube, I'm going to put his link somewhere here, did an initial test of the ShadowCast and found that, yeah, he had similar results. It's kind of like using one of those cheap no brand capture cards. But what you do get with the Genki is the app, the bespoke app, which is pretty good. It's really easy to use, easier than OBS by far. And you can use it in a browser, which is pretty freaking cool. It's compatible with Windows and Mac and Linux right off the bat. Is it compatible with Linux? I have to double check that. It is not compatible with Linux yet, but you can use it on Chrome or any Chromium browser. I'm using it right now with Edge, which is pretty cool. It works well. You can give this to someone who isn't a streamer, who isn't a gamer, who isn't even that tech savvy. They just plug it into their computer or laptop and tell them to go to this website, and it works. That's amazing. That's amazing. And it works well. I've never had, I was playing Monster Hunter Rise demo for a couple hours on it the other day, and it didn't have any drops. There were no times when the Genki seemed to overheat or needed to buffer anything at all. So I'm pretty impressed with the quality of the unit itself, and it's tiny. I mean, you can bring this wherever you go. It's more portable than the Nintendo Switch dock. If you only have the official dock, you can just keep it inside the little flap at the back, and it will fit there. That is a selling point, I think. It goes along with everything else that Human Things has created, making the Switch more portable than even Nintendo was able to do. Their Bluetooth audio, USB plug-in, their covert dock, which is amazing. I love that thing, which this works with very well. I'm using it with the covert dock right now. Just make sure that you're using the right cable. I accidentally tried using the covert docks. The ShadowCast cable on the covert dock. It doesn't work that way. It's not the right cable. That's why they made it a different color, I guess. Now, another thing that Genki... How many times have I said Genki instead of Human Things? Another thing that Human Things have claimed on the Kickstarter page that I don't really know is true or not is that it uses less resources or is lighter on your system than OBS or other alternative capturing apps. Because from what I've seen so far on Windows 10, at least, I can't speak for Mac, is that OBS version, what version do I have? OBS version 26.1.1 is lighter, at least on CPU load. It could be my system because I have a GPU with NVIDIA's new NVENC encoder. So maybe OBS is using that instead of CPU. I don't see why ShadowCast can't use the GPU instead of CPU if that resource is available. But there you have it. The proof is in the pudding. The usage stayed consistent even when I hit record on OBS, so you can see that it probably is the GPU taking the load instead of the CPU in my system. So depending on your system, these results may vary. Again, what they showed on the Kickstarter campaign, the Kickstarter page, is they compared it in Mac, and I don't have Macs. I don't have a Mac OS to test this on. Speaking of recording, the cool thing, one of the cool things about the ShadowCast app, which is called Arcade, Genki Arcade, is that it's got a built-in like recording feature. You don't need OBS, you don't need Elgato 4K capture utility, you don't need anything else. It's just built in there. You click a button and it will record. Now, the quality of the recording is basically what you see is what you get. It's not going to be great if you're recording at just 30 FPS or 720p. But for a lot of people, that's acceptable, and it will still look better than what the Nintendo Switch's built-in recording feature, the built-in capture feature. When you hit the capture button for 2 or 3 seconds, it's better than that. Unfortunately, Genki. Human Things decided to let the app record and save the video in WebM format, which is great if you want a smaller file size of video compared to MP4 or .h.264. But it is much harder to watch. Like, you might need special codecs on your computer. Definitely VLC will play it. What sucks about playing it in VLC is you can't use the seek bar to fast forward or rewind WebM videos. And you cannot drag WebM videos into Premiere Pro or DaVinci Resolve. They need to be converted first. And the only online converter that I have found that works to turn this thing into an MP4 is Zamzar. None of the others seem to work. I don't know why. Now, this isn't a big deal for most people, especially if you're not a content creator, because WebM files are smaller. You can watch them, and most people, after they save a preview, or rather they save a recording of their gameplay footage, when are you going to watch them again? Honestly, once you upload them to Facebook or YouTube or Twitter, you're set, right? And I believe all of those social media networks can take WebM right off the bat. Now, if you are a content creator, it might be a little bit more annoying to use the Genki Arcade app to record your footage. But then again, if you're a content creator, you're probably just using OBS, so not a big deal. One thing that should be stated about the recording feature in their built-in Genki Arcade app is that you can add in an external microphone, right, to record your voiceover while you're playing the game, but you cannot add an external webcam, because the way that it works is this is a web app. It's using Chromium resources and API to pull the Genki input and use that as a webcam feed. So as far as I know, you can't have multiple webcams being used by Chrome at the same time, or Chromium-based browsers, rather. So I'm not sure if Genki will ever be able to add that feature, but if they can, awesome. More power to you guys. One thing I didn't test, but I will after this, and just put my thoughts on in the description or in the comments below, is using it as a capture card to get your camera feed into. I didn't really test it this way because I already have an Elgato 4K cam link. So why would I use the Genki to do that? The Genki can accept a 4K input, but it will only output 1080p 60 FPS at the most. So I would expect if you were to plug in a DSLR or a mirrorless camera that can output to 4K to an external monitor, I assume that it would only downscale to 1080p. I'm going to do that right after the video and then just maybe do a voiceover or something about that. Yep, that's exactly what happened. So those are my thoughts on the Genki ShadowCast. I actually really, really like it, even though, Genki, or rather Human Things, seems to not really be upfront on their Kickstarter. Or if they were, then they weren't being 100% clear on the latency and where they measured, how they measured, what is the start of the chain and what is the end of the chain. Most people will be okay with this, I think, because I'm a casual gamer, borderline hardcore. Not really. I don't even play that much anymore, not as much as I used to. And it was fine for me. Like, I could play Monster Hunter Rise, I could play Super Smash Bros. And those are the games that I have that are most sensitive to latency. Other games, like, let's say, what is on my Switch right now? Pokemon Shield or Pokemon Sword, or other turn-based games like you know, Triangle Strategy, the demo, or Fire Emblem, slower games like that, then the capture card is going to be perfectly fine. The latency, you might just think that that's the game latency. But if you're more competitive than me, if you're a hardcore gamer and you actually do tournaments and shit, then yeah, this might not be the one for you. You might have to pass on it until Genki clears things up, because they said that they can address the latency issue with updates. They have attempted to in one of their past comments on their Kickstarter page, when somebody raised the fact that another YouTuber made a video to compare the latency of the ShadowCast with standard no brand capture cards. Genki did say that there is a problem in the Windows version of the app and they could update it, so they did. And the YouTuber, our buddy Brain, checked it out and said nothing changed. So I don't know. We will have to see. If you are sensitive to latency at all, maybe don't get this yet, or maybe borrow one from someone else. I thought that I would be sensitive to latency, but I found that it's fine for me. Then again, I found that my other capture cards, like the 4K60, the HD60S, they were fine for playing on too. I didn't really care about the latency. So that's my review for the ShadowCast. It's super casual, and I hate this background, so I'm going to go. Bye.
End of review.
Oh yeah, like and subscribe and that shit. Whatever.